I'm Ann Fleming from the Episcopal Church in Colorado, and I will be hosting the webinar today. I'm joined by 3 representatives from the organization Spiritual Direction Colorado: Tony Hill, Connie Shelley, and Kyle Turner. Spiritual Direction Colorado is an ecumenical group of spiritual directors in the state of Colorado, with the goal of promoting spiritual direction and supporting spiritual directors across the state. We will begin the webinar with 3 presentations about spiritual direction, given by Tony, Connie, and Kyle, with each presenter addressing these 3 questions. How is spiritual direction a part of a spiritual discipline? What is your personal approach to spiritual direction? And how can spiritual direction enhance a person's spiritual journey? Following the presentation, we will have approximately 15 minutes for questions and answers. If you'd like to submit a question, use Zoom's online chat feature and direct your questions to Ann Fleming. I will then facilitate the answering of the questions. Also, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please send a chat to Mike Orr, that's O-R-R. With that, I'd like to turn over the session to our first presenter, the Reverend Tony Hill. Tony is a graduate of both the Iliff School of Theology and the Benedictine Spiritual Formation Program. He is a spiritual director and an ordained elder in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and is currently pastor of the St. Luke CME Church in Denver. Tony also works as a substance abuse treatment counselor and serves as an adjunct instructor at Iliff School of Theology. Tony?
All right, thank you. First of all, let me just thank Donna Contreras Weatherby and other members of Spiritual Directors Colorado for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Thank you, Ann, for facilitating today. I would like to begin by addressing the 3 questions. First of all, when it comes to the question of spiritual direction as a part of a spiritual discipline, I have found in my experience that spiritual disciplines such as prayer, such as reading of scripture, meditation, and even charitable work are enhanced by spiritual direction. With spiritual direction, we have an opportunity to facilitate a hospitable environment, not only a safe space, but a spiritual place where one can meet with a companion or a partner on their Christian journey. I have found, again, in my experience, that it provokes engagement with God. Not only engagement with God, but fellowship with a fellow brother or sister or traveler. And it encourages us to follow Jesus Christ out into the world, and gives us an opportunity to meet with someone and to share with them how that discipleship journey is going. And so I found that as a directee and as a director, discipleship is enhanced. There's some accountability, and there's also encouragement. Secondly, when it comes to my personal approach to spiritual direction, I usually meet with a directee in my office, or I have met in other places, such as sacred spaces on the Iliff campus, in church chapels, or other meeting rooms. I think it's important that whatever space one meets in, that it's consecrated, at least for that time that we are meeting. It's designated for that particular purpose, that it's a quiet space, that it's inviting and comfortable, that it's simple. I normally have a place where there are 2 chairs, and a small table, candle, singing bowl, prayer cloth, or some other visual symbolic item. Here, as we meet today, I have a candle lit, and I have a sacred talking stick that someone made for me from Africa, covered in kente cloth and other things that just kind of help set the tone. I usually start with an opening question. How goes the journey? Or where have you witnessed God in your experience since the last time we've met? Where have you seen God operating in your life? And then realize that it's not a science, it's an art, as the Spirit creatively engages the individual and myself in dialogue and conversation. It's not something that I feel that I have to control. Usually, the meeting is about an hour or so. It ends with a closing prayer or silent reflection. And so that's my personal approach to spiritual direction, and that's kind of the setting that I am used to. I have been in other settings and learned from others, but those are the ones that I'm most comfortably gather in. And then thirdly, as far as spiritual direction enhancing one's spiritual journey, I mentioned earlier the benefit of having companionship, of knowing that we are not alone in our journey. I think besides that spiritual direction gives us intentionality. I mentioned earlier the accountability when when I look forward to meeting with my directee or my spiritual director, then I'm doing things with some intention, and I'm aware of that my labor is not in vain. I'm aware that there's a witness to what I am sharing or what I am hearing. I'm aware of the scripture, for instance, that says, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I in the midst of them. And so I've only been actively in the spiritual direction engagement for, I'd say it's been about 4 years now. And it's been a rewarding experience for me. It has helped me in my ministry, and it has helped me as a father and as a husband, and it's helped me as a companion to others who are on their spiritual journey.
Thanks a lot, Tony. So next up, we're going to go to Connie. Connie, since 2008, has been the coordinator of the Spiritual Direction Program and spiritual director in the Denver Women's Correctional Facility under the umbrella of the Center for Spirituality at Work. Connie?
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Tony, for plowing through the field here. Spiritual discipline, to me, one of the hardest, I think, is listening. When I'm with a directee, I am listening for God's invitation in their life. And so listening would be a big part of that. I also believe that prayer before and after, a lot of times when, especially with women in the prison, I will come home and do a lot of meditation around the session so I can hear how God is leading me to lead them or to be with them. When I'm in a spiritual direction session with someone, I realize that I'm not the director, I'm simply the listener. And so there's 2 or 3 or more of us, if it's a group spiritual direction, we're simply listening for the direction of the Spirit. So listening is huge, but also I think it's important that I continue to read, to learn, continuing education, conferences. There's a lot of great books out there, and that I hold myself accountable for how I am being with people. My own personal way of being a spiritual director, I've been a spiritual director since 2001. One of the things that I think is important is either some silence or some prayer to begin a session. And then from there on, it's so individualized. It's not one size fits all. So I have some people who love imaging, and so we do some imaging guidance. I have some people who love meditation, and I have others that can't stand 2 minutes of silence. So I try to use the session in the way that the person that I'm with needs. Sometimes we meditate on scripture. Depends too on whether I'm with someone who's Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim. It depends on what their holy scriptures are. I have a room in my home that's dedicated for spiritual direction. And when we're at the prison, we do it in the facility units, which is simply a fishbowl. It's a room with a lot of windows, and there's a lot of people moving around and looking and wondering what we're doing. And that's been a little uncomfortable for me, but I'm getting used to it. I think spiritual direction is really important. It's been life-changing for me. I've been in spiritual direction since 1995. It helped me give words to some of the things that I was feeling and thinking and didn't have the words for. It puts a spotlight on, sometimes it's just everyday things that we don't think about, but when we talk about them and they're spotlighted, we see how important they can be. And it spotlights the possibilities. If we wake up every day and we think this day has possibilities, but we don't see them, I don't see them. I suggest practices or books or authors that might be helpful to someone. You know, what speaks to me may not speak to somebody else, but I try to be aware of the things, of the books and of the authors that people could use that might be useful for them. And I think a big piece is a spiritual director helps a person relax. Sometimes they come to a session and they say, I've tried this, I've read all these books, I've heard these things, and this is how it's supposed to be, and it's not working for me. And you can just say, okay, let's find something that does. And to assure them that not everything works for everybody. So those are basically my way. We close with prayer. We close with making a new appointment if that's what they feel they need. And we pray for each other on a daily basis.
Thank you very much, Connie. That was very helpful. Next, we're going to go to Kyle Turner. Kyle is a pastoral minister, liturgist, and spiritual director who was born and raised in the spiritually enchanted land of New Mexico. He has more than 15 years of experience working in parish and campus ministry. Kyle?
Well, thank you, Anne, and thanks to Tony and Connie for joining me on this webinar. I'm really excited to be here. And thanks to those of you who have turned in, and also special thanks to both Tracy and Connie, who were kind of behind the scenes helping us get this up and running. And so yeah, I'm going to discuss the same questions that were posed to Tony and Connie, but from my experience, and I pause this week, especially the craziness of our world, and realize that there is a lot of restlessness in our world today. A lot of restlessness that I think is definitely part of the human condition. But today, particularly, I feel that restlessness is exceedingly palpable in all corners of our society, especially in this country today. I think St. Augustine noted well in his Confessions, written some 1600 years ago, when he wrote, "Our heart is restless until it rests in you." And I think this speaks well to this human condition of restlessness. I had a professor once who used a great image of God, the creator, in creating the heavens and the earth. And when God created the earth, God took a vessel, like a jug, and took that jug and poured out over the earth many, many blessings. Grace, love, beauty, art, creativity, all these wonderful blessings that we've been blessed with. And at the very last minute, when there was one last blessing in that jug, God took that jug and lifted it back up and kept that last blessing to God's self. And that last blessing was complete and utter rest. And I think that Augustine speaks to this, and that is part of our task as spiritual directors, is to help people, journey with people in this restlessness, to make sense of this restlessness that is a part of the human condition. Spiritual direction as a part of spiritual discipline is because I believe it helps one to wrestle with that restlessness and try and figure out what that means for one in his or her life, and how one can seek out that relationship with God, the divine, whatever words or names they may put to the Great One. For centuries, people have sought spiritual guidance in a number of different ways. And I think to reflect deeply on one's daily life is an important piece of this. And I think that spiritual direction in today's society is something that's really been reclaimed as an ancient practice that we can use today in our world today, in the busyness of our hectic lives. I know I can speak for one. I lead a very hectic life, shuttling my 5-year-old back and forth to school and chasing after our 2.5-year-old and juggling a whole bunch of different things. So spiritual direction allows me to center myself, to enter into some quiet for a bit of time, and to seek out where God is calling me in my life. As a Christian, I would really identify the true director in spiritual direction, though, as being God's Spirit. Myself, as the quote-unquote spiritual director, is one who journeys with another person to seek out what that direction is from God. I'm struck by this image. I'm going to hold up this catalog here. This is SDI, Spiritual Directors International. They put out an annual resource, and it's a seek and find guide is what they call it. And on the cover of this, the last couple of years, they've used this image of 3 chairs right on the cover. And I think this image is helpful for us when reflecting upon spiritual direction to realize that 2 chairs are important, certainly. Myself as a spiritual director, or when I'm in spiritual direction myself, take up one of those chairs, and then the other person I'm meeting with takes up one of the others. But the 3rd chair is left empty because that is God's Spirit who enters in and joins the conversation, joins the reflection, helps to guide the conversation. I'd like to borrow from a friend of mine and a former member of the Spiritual Direction Colorado Committee, Kent Ira Groff. Kent has a great image, great metaphor that he uses in talking about spiritual direction. And what Kent says is he is just one beggar journeying with another beggar, seeking bread. And I love that image of the relationship in spiritual direction of journeying with another, 2 beggars seeking bread. In particular, in that relationship, seeking bread for the directee, the person who is entering into spiritual direction with a spiritual guide or spiritual director. My experience with spiritual direction began as an undergraduate when I was attending the University of New Mexico. And at that point in time, I had my sights set on medical school. I was going to be a cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon. I was volunteering in an emergency room. Those were my plans. I was going to be this world-class surgeon. But I had some experiences in college that helped me to open up my eyes to what God was calling me to ultimately in my life. And those were my first experiences of spiritual direction, meeting with a Dominican friar, a Dominican priest, who helped me to reflect upon what that call was. And ultimately, I found that I was being called. Sometimes it was kicking and screaming, but into a life in ministry. And that was what God had in store for me. So that vocational call was really helped. It was made real to me through my experiences, my initial experiences of being someone in spiritual direction who has helped to find out where God was truly calling me. I went on to Boston College to study ministry. I had a great Ignatian spirituality in a lot of my courses that really helped to form me in those years, and experienced a lot of group spiritual direction. It was helpful, us as students, to reflect upon our experiences as students and what that meant for us as those who are preparing for ministry professionally. So how is spiritual direction a part of spiritual discipline? I think it's a key part. Ultimately, it helps one to reflect upon daily life, where God's calling oneself, and maybe what is in store down the road. My own personal approach to spiritual direction is interesting, I guess. Right now, I'm mostly doing one-on-one spiritual direction with individuals. I have in the past done group spiritual direction, particularly with young adults who are spending a year here in Denver, engaged in full-time volunteer work with people living in poverty. Colorado Vincentian Volunteers is a great organization, the one that I've worked with in the past. There's also the Urban Servant Corps here in Denver. They do some great work, young adults fresh out of college who are spending and dedicating a year of their lives to working with folks who are really on the margins. Today, when my one-on-one experiences, I usually meet either in my home or in a church office, but at times also meet out in society, maybe in a park, a coffee shop, by a Cherry Creek right downtown. I've met with folks, or even in a brewery. I've had experiences in the past where a directee and I share a common interest in craft beer. So we'd meet at a brewery and have a spiritual direction session there. And that was something that was mutually agreed upon, he and I. There was a great Presbyterian minister who had a great understanding, I think, of the space between two people. And he said, the space between two people in honest communication with one another becomes holy ground. And this Presbyterian minister, Reverend Rogers, or as he's more commonly known as Mr. Rogers, who was a great formator for me in my own childhood, Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, had a great understanding of that space between two people becoming holy ground, entering into an honest communication with another. His ministry was through television, talking to children, but he used the television camera as a space to connect with children growing up, being formed in their own lives, and helping them along their journeys. So I usually meet with someone for an hour, always try and enter into some silence, some sacred silence initially. That might be difficult in a public space, but we do our best to do so. And then I usually break open either some sacred scripture or sacred writing by a spiritual writer, or some type of a prayer. And then, kind of as Connie mentioned, each session really takes a life of its own, really focused on what the person is dealing with in their life, helping them to reflect on their experiences, where God is in that experience, and where they're being called to. Often I'll enter into some practice of Lectio Divina, holy reading of a text, a sacred text, whether that's scripture or another sacred writing. And then I always make sure to end with prayer, again, to try and keep centered. I do try and incorporate some silence, certainly, because, as I mentioned, part of the restlessness, in particular with our world today, is just the busyness, the craziness of how our life can be in our society. And then the last question, how can spiritual direction enhance a person's spiritual journey? I really think I kind of covered some of that, but really trying to be attentive to what God's call is in their life, allow the things I've wrestled with folks center around vocational call, wrestling with where God is calling them, maybe helping someone to enhance their prayer life, offering ideas, and really truly being a companion on the journey. And I want to end with one of my favorite poems. It comes from Elizabeth Barrett Browning in the poem Aurora Lee. And I think it offers some great insight into this sacred practice of spiritual direction. And in the poem, she writes, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only the one who sees takes off their shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries, and daub their natural faces unaware." And I think this is particularly appropriate for our world today. That word blackberries might be replaced with iPhones, or 5 years ago, actual BlackBerry phones. Oftentimes we sit around, pluck at our blackberries or our phones, and we miss the presence of God right in front of us. And so spiritual direction really can help us to open our eyes, our ears to where God is calling us. Thank you.
So for all of our listeners who've joined us, I hope this has been a helpful way to set the conversation. The goal of doing this today is to try to step into some 21st century ways of connecting with people who don't maybe understand what spiritual direction is. So please engage with us. Type in chats to Ann Fleming, and I will share them with the panel. I do have one question that's come in, which any of the three of you may answer. If anyone writing in wants to direct it to any of the directors we have, Kyle or Connie, or Reverend Hill, just let us know in the chat. The first question I have is, why might a person come to you as a spiritual director instead of going to his or her pastor? And is there a role for both?
They're two separate things in my mind. A pastor may often be more directive, more concrete suggestions, more concrete actions that a person needs to take. Where a spiritual director, in my experience, is less directive, less concrete. Might say, have you read or have you prayed this or have you tried this? But we don't do as much teaching or as much solid instruction, where I think a pastoral counselor might have very concrete things for a person to try. I think we're just less concrete. That's my experience.
I was having a conversation a couple weeks ago, actually, with a Catholic priest, and he had been in some conversations with the Catholic Archdiocese, and he'd be talking with one of their staff people there, and recommended that this would be a great thing to have in every single Catholic parish, and that was the world he was speaking in, is to have spiritual direction available for people. And what he was talking about was not the clergy per se in the Catholic world being the ones offering the spiritual direction, but rather having professional spiritual directors, whether that's lay people or ordained ministers who are spiritual directors, coming in or being available to meet with people in spiritual direction. Because oftentimes, and maybe Tony, you can speak to this as a pastor, pastors can be so overwhelmed with just everything that it takes to be a pastor, whether it is, meeting with a grieving family who's lost a loved one, or, you've got a boiler that's leaking and, you've got to oversee those maintenance type of things. Every church is different, certainly, but I've worked in parishes and in churches in the past, and I know how taxed the clergy can get it sometimes. So I think the opportunity for spiritual directors to meet with people in a professional sense, outside of just meeting with one's pastor, can be a helpful thing.
Yes, I would agree with both Connie and Kyle, and would just add that the relationship the power relationship between a pastor and a parishioner could often get in the way. I recall when I was being trained in the Benedictine Spiritual Formation Program, we were advised, for those of us who are pastors, not to offer spiritual direction for those who are under our care. That we could provide spiritual direction in the sense of having someone else there who could, be a director to our parishioners. And it'd be fine for me, for instance, to do spiritual direction outside of my own a congregation. And that's pretty much what I have stuck to since that time.
So another question has come in for our panel. How do I get started if I would like a spiritual director? And I think some of that related to that is, how do you find the right spiritual director for you?
Those are good questions, certainly. For years now, Spiritual Directors International has provided that Seek and Find guide that I am offered here, that has a listing of spiritual directors by state and region. But how do you know? You've got a whole list of people, names. How am I to know that one person's the right fit for me? I think maybe asking around can be helpful. A lot of the people I've met with have been referred to me. So other spiritual directors or people in ministry have referred them to me for spiritual direction. But an exciting thing that we're going to be starting here soon in the coming months with Spiritual Direction Colorado is to provide a similar resource on our own website, which is spiritualdirectioncolorado.org, where we will have the opportunity for spiritual directors who would like to be listed in there to promote themselves to be listed as a resource. So that is coming in future months, where we will actually have a localized type of database of spiritual directors. Now, we can't say one way or another, can't vouch for anyone in particular. So we'll have kind of a disclaimer on there saying, it's kind of at your own risk as to whether it's going to work out for you or not. I've had experiences where I've met with people, and after one or two sessions, we just both realize and agree this isn't a good fit, and that's okay. And then maybe I refer them on to somebody else. Well, why don't you go check out this other spiritual director, see if that might be a better fit? Because not every relationship in terms of spiritual direction is a great fit. So those are a couple of things that come to mind initially.
Tony, Connie, do you have any other comments to add to that?
Connie's still muted.
Connie, you're still muted.
There. I wasn't able to get it unmuted. I think people need to realize that they should be absolutely free to interview. I talked with a woman last night who said she had talked with several spiritual directors in the area, and that's fine. We are all different personalities. We have different ways. We have, and then directing needs to feel absolutely comfortable with the person that they're with. And so feel free to call a couple of them or more and interview them.
I would agree.
So you have all talked a little bit about how you got started and how long you've been doing spiritual direction. What type of training and or certification do spiritual directors get in order to serve in this role, or does that vary widely?
Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay. I think it varies pretty widely. My own experience, so I went to Boston College, Jesuit Catholic University for my master's degree in pastoral ministry with a focus on liturgy and worship. But while I was there, and then in subsequent years working in parish ministry, I really felt a calling myself to spiritual direction. So my program actually offers a postmaster's program in the certification for spiritual direction. So that's what I did. It was a 3-year summer program, which during the year is done remotely, and then is 2 weeks in residence in Massachusetts that I would go out for the summer session and be there. And it was great. And it was very intense those couple of weeks while we were there, and it was a phenomenal program, and I really learned a lot through that. But we have some other programs here locally that I know both Connie and Tony have been a part of, and maybe they could speak to their experiences there.
Yes, at the Iliff School of Theology, I recall back in the fall of 2011 as a student there, when one of my pastoral care professors passed out some papers, and we were looking and reading them, and it said, "Do you want a spiritual director?" And at the time, I had never heard of such a thing. And once I read what the description was and what the requirements was, that it, it wasn't counseling, and that it, required you to meet with someone once a month and to just share in your Christian journey. And it interested me. And so I began as a directee. I found out that my director was actually in a spiritual direction program, which is a joint program through the Iliff School of Theology and the Benedictine sisters down at Bennett Hill. After being under direction for about a year, I felt called or led to find out what the requirements were to be certified as a spiritual director. And I use the term, of course, certification loosely, basically what the program entailed. I joined the program in 2012 and graduated in 2014.
My experience was with the Center for Spirituality at Work, which is a program based on Vincentian spirituality. And if you don't know what Vincentian is, think St. Vincent de Paul, and you know that it has a heart for those who live in the margins or who are marginalized by society. And this appealed to me and has continued to appeal to me. I continue to be a facilitator with that program. It's called Spiritual Formation for Spiritual Directors. And it can be a watershed event. It was for me. It just opened up a whole new world. So we do require in our program that everybody during their internship, during the time of their program, that they are involved with spiritual direction with someone in the margins in some way, whether it be people who are on the streets or homeless or as in prison, however, but that's one of the requirements of our program. I think that's important because, that's where Jesus is, if that's what we're looking for. So I have deeply appreciated that and have loved to see where our students have been excited about serving.
So I have another question. This comes from Daniel. It says, I'm curious if any of the speakers see any movement towards the creation of spiritual direction practices, as in, like with counseling, where there is a shared space and mutual support, etc. There are organizations like SDCO and SDI, but most spiritual directors seem to work alone. I wonder if that kind of structure would help to make spiritual direction be more accepted in the greater community. Welcome your responses to that.
Well, I think we all three probably belong to what's called a peer supervision group. I belong to two of them because for those of us who work in the prison, it's really important because that's a very different kind of atmosphere and situation. So we have a monthly peer supervision group. We get together And the other supervision group is for those of us who have a practice out, just with the general population. So we do get together. We learn from each other. We hear each other. We pray together. We listen to what's moving in each of the spiritual directors' lives and what we're being invited to by God. So we do have those, and that is very different than SDCO or SDI.
I also belong to a supervision group that meets once a month. I also am in the process of seeing whether or not I've been accepted at the Center for Action and Contemplation in New Mexico. I guess I'll know in January, February of next year, but I've gone through the process, offered myself up. I feel led to do so just to broaden and to deepen my understanding of spiritual direction and to engage with others who've been on a journey. I really love the writings of Richard Rohr. And once I really looked at the program that he offers, which is a 2-year program, that it's something that I could actually do from 2017 to 2019. And so that's where I'm at on that.
I wasn't quite sure if I understood Daniel's question. Could you repeat just the beginning part about, was he talking about a center outside?
Yeah, it says, I think it has to do with he refers to the creation of spiritual direction practices, a movement towards creating shared space and mutual support. So I think similar to what Tony's talking about with the Center for Contemplation and Action. Mm-hmm. Is that helpful?
Yeah. No, and I think there's are opportunities for something like that. I know that here in town, there's a downtown, the Lanteri Center for Ignatian Spirituality. I'm not real familiar with their but I know it's an actual center and offers spiritual direction. And I think there might be a couple others around, but I think certainly the peer supervision groups, and then like what Reverend Hill was talking about, Center for Action and Contemplation. Was that the Living School then, Tony? And I know Connie is a recent graduate of that program, which is a 2-year program out of the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque. And it's really kind of centered in on the teachings of Richard Rohr, and a wonderful program I've heard. So just a little plug, in November, Connie's actually going to be presenting a workshop in person as a preview for our upcoming conference in January, in which Richard Rohr is actually going to be our speaker. But in November, November 3rd is the date, she'll be doing a workshop about the Living School and her experience, a faith perspective on the Living School for Action and Contemplation.
Love the plug. Keep them coming. I did get a question on cost. What is the cost of a typical session? Particularly when someone is first doing an initial interview, if they're interviewing a number of spiritual directors, is there cost to that? Is that something that's contracted? Can you give any general sense on that?
Al, we're gonna go. I'll start off simply saying that, well, no, if somebody's interviewing me, I wouldn't think of having any kind of cost. There's no contract. Generally, I have not been paid one penny by the women at Denver Women's Correctional. So I am not in it for the money or for any kind of recompense. I have no. What I do with a private directee is simply tell them that I will accept whatever they're comfortable with, that it does help me go to conferences and workshops and things to continue my education. Like last summer, we had a retreat on soul trauma, which is a whole different thing. And I'm really, really trying to get more information about this. So there are things out there that I need to continue to expand my understanding and my education about. And so I do use money for that, but I don't have a set charge. But I am blessed to be in a place where I don't have to have.
I think there's a wide range, certainly. There may be church congregations or parishes where they have a staff member who is a spiritual director that offers it as part of their ministry. But of course, I know that not every congregation or parish has that. For an individual kind of freelance spiritual directors like myself, I meet with people one-on-one. Always, I take interviews. I've actually have had people interview me over the phone. And I always have our first initial session there's no charge, certainly. It's a full hour long. Part of that time is to kind of orient the individual to the practice of spiritual direction and my own approach to it, and which, whether they've had experience in the past or not, will certainly be different, because I'm different from somebody else. And then I operate because it's part of, I used to work in a church, and I'm not currently. I'm doing a few different freelance jobs in addition to taking care of our girls, but it's part of what I need for my own income to help turn on the lights. And so I do have a sliding scale and try and come to a mutual discernment with that individual as to what can work for them. And then we mutually decide that and go forward from there. And I also share with them that, this is something that if, going forward, if it just isn't a right fit, it's not like they're bound to continue to meet with me on a monthly basis for eternity. We make it work as long as we can. Thanks.
So since we're talking about sliding scales, it brings up another question. How is spiritual direction different or similar to psychotherapy or counseling?
Well, I'll jump in here because I wear both hats. Of course, as you mentioned earlier, I am a substance abuse treatment counselor. And of course, in the counseling world, I'm primarily looking at people and diagnosing them with some particular ailment or issue and looking to solve problems. They're goal-oriented, and that's definitely not what spiritual direction is about. And so that would be the biggest difference. There are some similarities in the sense of listening and companioning and joining with people. But the goal of a counselor, of course, is to help a person with their problems and to receive treatment.
70% of the women at Denver Correctional Facility have a mental illness of some kind. I am not qualified to take care of that. I am only there for their spiritual questions and seeking. I can't say that they get a lot of help at Denver Correctional, but there are psychologists and psychiatrists that come in and see the women. Just as somebody goes to a doctor for their physical or a psychologist or psychiatrist for their emotional or mental, a spiritual director is for your spiritual. It's a very separate thing. And I don't try to cross over because I wouldn't be able to.
I too am not qualified as a professional counselor. So anytime that there's an issue that may pop up that I am not equipped to adequately respond to or give any guidance, my first step would then be to try and refer them to someone who is a professional who could, because there is definitely a divide. And that's one thing when I was going through my training program at Boston College that we were really guarded against, was to realize that we are not professional counselors. It is, as Connie mentioned, it's a very different thing. It's working with the spiritual and working with someone to discuss and probe through those spiritual questions in their life. Of course, emotional and mental comes in to play, but really the focus is on the spiritual.
So, oh, go ahead.
Well, I would just want to add that that's one of the things that they are finding. I'm reading a book, or I've read a book about a guy who followed veterans for the last 50 years. They have PTSD or they have physical wounds, but nobody's addressed the spiritual component of those wounds. And so that's a very different thing. And I don't know if society hasn't recognized it yet. I don't think.
That actually brings me to the next question that I have. I'd like all three of you to weigh in on this. What are your thoughts on when people should seek a spiritual director? I mean, I think there are times that might be more of an acute thing, but there are other times that happen in life with different transitions we go through. What are your thoughts on when someone might be going, how do I heal those spiritual wounds that I have? I've taken it as far as I can, physically and emotionally.
That was my experience. That's when I got into spiritual direction. My husband at that time had Alzheimer's, and I just thought that didn't happen to people who believed that God was only going to give us good things. So I went to a spiritual director. But there are times, and people are certainly welcome to come only when they're in some kind of spiritual crisis. That's fine. But for the long term, it's also good too, because once you have dealt with your pressing issue, the most pressing issue in front of you, then there's the long haul. And so either way is good.
I think it can be a really good and healthy thing to be engaged in spiritual direction ongoing, even outside of those spiritual crises times, certainly. I think partially because of the restlessness I was talking about, it may not be necessarily a crisis, but I really do think that there's this ongoing restlessness in our lives that spiritual direction can help to address and help us to reflect upon and to try and bring us closer to that ultimate rest, I guess. But certainly if there are moments of dark nights of the soul or spiritual trauma that one needs to address in those acute times, are certainly great opportunities to engage in spiritual direction.
Yeah. And I would just add that when we get to a point where we realize that there's a voice speaking to us like we'd never heard before. You know the story, I'm sure some of you do, of Samuel, Samuel, who thought Eli, the priest, was calling him in the night, and he kept getting up and going to him saying, "Did you call me?" And "No, I didn't call you. Go back to sleep." And after the third time, he recognized that God was speaking to him. I think when a person gets to the point where they have talked to other human beings and no one has answers that satisfy them, and they realize that it's something beyond what any human advice or direction could give, then a person might seek spiritual direction. In other words, what is God saying to me, or how is God calling me in my life?
I have an example of one of the women that I have been seeing for 8 or 9 years now, who, when I first started, we had been together for maybe 6 months or a year. And she came in one day and I said, "So how's it going?" And she said, "I am mad as hell." And I said, "So what's going on?" And she said, "I've been doing everything they told me I needed to do. I've been praying, I've been reading my Bible, I've been reading daily bread, I've been going to church services, blah, blah, blah. And I just found out I still have 7 more years to go. And we kind of diffused the issue there at that session. But then I said, you know, now we can work. Now you know that things, we're not in control of things. We can't control what's going to happen around us in our life and in our environment. And so we can now find God in what's real.
Well, I don't know if you guys are paying attention to the time, but we are almost up with our hour that we had planned. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank each one of you for your time and your insight, the information, and for the work that you do. So thank you, Reverend Hill and Connie and Kyle. Thank you to Spiritual Direction Colorado for reaching out to us to help make this happen. For those of you who missed part of this, this session has been recorded and will be available on social media and on the Episcopal Church in Colorado's Faith Formation website for further viewing. With that, I would just like to say thank you so much and have a wonderful day.